everyone. My name is Denise Olson. I'm Director of Education Marketing at GBH. You are at the Civil Rights Movement Beyond Moving Beyond the Familiar Story webinar for educators of grades 6 through 12. I want to echo Alicia's welcome. We know that teachers are very busy, especially this time of year, and we appreciate you joining us to learn about some of our media resources to integrate into your classes. Next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, GBH is Boston's flagship PBS station. We are also the producers of, I would say, most of the most well-known shows on PBS, including American Experience, Frontline Nova, and many of the kids shows that you see here. Next slide, please. We are also the partners with PBS in the PBS LearningMedia platform. PBS LearningMedia is the PBS network's digital learning resource platform for grades pre-K through 12. It's a partnership of GBH and PBS, and it has cross-disciplinary resources for all of those grades. Not cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary. And during the 2023-2024 school year, the platform had 17 million users and 70 million page views. And if you're not familiar, we encourage you to go on the platform. Most of the resources we're talking about tonight are on the platform. Next slide, please. So I'd like to present tonight's presenters. They are my colleagues, and each is a longtime educator with experience in the classroom. First is Susan Wilkins. Sue is the Director of Social Studies Curriculum and Instruction for GBH and PBS LearningMedia. She leads social studies work in the GBH Education Department, ranging from the creation of the award-winning U.S. History Collection and the Civics Collection to the Nuclear Weapons and Security Policy Collection. Sue is a longtime educator and was the History Methods instructor in the Newton Teacher Residency Program. Alicia Butler is a 25-year veteran social studies teacher. In addition to working at GBH Education, she teaches U.S. history and African American studies for the District of Columbia Public Schools. Alicia was recognized as the 2019 History Teacher of the Year by the Daughters of the American Revolution for the District of Columbia and the 2019 Gilder Lehrman National History Teacher of the Year for her innovative lessons and civic-based student projects. An experienced social studies teacher, Lindsay Galveo taught grades 5 through 12 for 10 years. She has also worked as a legislative aide for the 5th Middlesex District in the Massachusetts State Legislature, and she served as the research director for the House Committee on Post-Audit and Oversight. Throughout her career, Lindsay has been an instructor for numerous professional development workshops and written social studies, lesson plans, and education articles for several organizations. So now I would like to turn it over to Sue. Or Alicia, I think, first. Sorry.
No worries. Thanks a lot, Denise. All right, everyone. We are so happy that you could join us tonight. And I must say that one of the things that really makes these webinars so enjoyable to host is the fact that our attendees bring and they share so much of their expert knowledge and invaluable experience in the topic. And that was clearly, seen in just the descriptions that people were giving of like where they're coming from and their experience and how many years they've been teaching, et cetera, et cetera. So what we wanted to do is start off with a fun trivia question. So this activity is called, Can You Guess My Court Case? Can you guess the major school desegregation court case based upon the following description? So it reads, the local public school was next to my house. However, according to school board policy, I was not allowed to attend, and I had to instead walk a mile to the school for Black children. My parents sued the school and won their case, but the school board appealed it, sending my case to a higher court where they ruled that all children had equal rights and that the school had violated mine. The impact of my case extended beyond my state and was cited in subsequent court cases around the country. Next slide. So my question is it Tape versus Hurley? Is it Brown versus Board of Education? Is it Clark versus Board of School Directors? Or is it Mendez versus Westminster? And I love it because even before I can even get done describing, I had so many people throw in B, Brown versus Board of Education. I got one person that says Tate versus Hurley, which is great. All right, but I'm looking and the majority of the answers are all Brown. Okay, I got one person that says C, Clark versus Board of School Directors. One person thrown in Mendez versus Westminster. Why not? All right, but it looks like overwhelmingly most of the answers are B. Thank you so much for participating in that. Well, could we go to the next slide? Kudos for those of you that answered C, Clark versus Board of School Directors. And this is actually an 1868 court case. Now look, it is not surprising that many of us guessed Brown versus Board of Ed because the conditions around these two cases were extremely similar. Next slide. But just to give you a little bit of context for this particular case, 86 years before the U.S. Supreme Court's historic Brown versus Board of Ed desegregation ruling, 89 years before federal troops are dispatched to Little Rock to help desegregate schools there, and more than 90 years before James Meredith integrates the University of Mississippi, more than 90 years before Governor Wallace, all right, stands in the doorway trying to block Black students from entering the University of Alabama, you've got Clark versus Board of Directors in 1868. And this case actually involved a 12-year-old Susan Clark, who was the daughter of Alexander Clark, who was a prominent businessman in Iowa, 1860s, right? They filed a lawsuit against the Muscatine, Iowa School District for denying Susan the right to be admitted to a public school simply because she was Black. The importance of this case is that it was actually cited 86 years later in the Brown versus Board of Education case. Now, his case is important for several reasons. Number one, it shows us and our students that the fight for school integration did not begin in 1954. Not only that, it shows us that school segregation was not regulated to the southern states. I mean, we're talking Iowa in 1868, right? It also shows us that the fight for civil rights can be seen right after emancipation. And in fact, there are other school desegregation cases, even older than this one, that take place prior to Clark's by free Black families that were living in the North before the Civil War, which we'll actually discuss momentarily. Next slide. So that actually leads us to what today's essential question is and the purpose of why we're here, right? We're going to try and explore how can we broaden the narrative of the civil rights movement to encompass well-known cases like Brown versus Board, but also underrepresented agents, like in this case with Clark. We'll also take a look at strategies and historical perspectives. And the goals of this tonight's webinar is basically to try to identify the limitations of the typical civil rights movement scope and sequence. We're going to examine the diverse range of PBS LearningMedia resources that you can use tonight. You can literally take to your classroom tomorrow and use it. We're also going to explore how PBS LearningMedia resources can be integrated into the typical scope and sequence to expand the narrative. So what makes our webinar different, not only are we going to give you some new content perhaps you're not used to, not only are we going to give you some resources that are ready-made and free, by the way, but we're also going to give you some examples of exactly how you can use them. Next slide. Now, for many of us history lovers, cases like Alexander Clark and the Iowa Supreme Court, they're interesting. But we should also consider the importance of knowing about this case through the lens of a matter of civic necessity, and one that's actually essential to the preservation and the furtherance of democracy, which leads me to our why tonight. We always have our why, not just what we're going to be doing, not just our goals, but why is this important? If you take a look at this Pew Research study, it shows us that Americans have developed an alarming disillusionment with their belief that they can actually influence the government. In essence, the data that you're seeing actually shows us that 42%, that's almost half of Americans today, do not believe that their vote can make a difference, that they're petitioning, attending town halls, protesting, writing to their elected officials, or even running for office can make a difference. And I guess the question I would pose for you is really realistically, how can democracy really thrive when almost half of the citizens don't believe that their efforts are worth it and that their voice can be heard? Now, when we were looking at some of the questions that you all posed ahead of the webinar, I know that one of the questions was, how can we teach this movement with hope, right? Well, we can do this by letting our students know that this movement can give us hope today because it's a model for how regular people and grassroots efforts led to the most important civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. But the importance of what we're doing tonight is that when we broaden the stories of the civil rights movement and we include people like Alexander Clark, which many of us until our opening activity weren't really familiar with, and Susan Clark, it offers students hope because they're hearing about individuals outside of those that they're already familiar with. And not only that, it also helps them to understand that change does not come overnight, right? And sometimes it could actually take 86 years before you see that change. But their participation does matter, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem. And it's an essential stop along the eventual road to victory. And that's the importance of broadening the story. Next slide. So I'd love to hear from you all before we dive into even more content. What are some obstacles that you find that you're specifically encountering in the classroom when teaching about the civil rights movement? Do you feel like you've got access to few engaging new resources? Do you feel like perhaps maybe you have a little bit limited knowledge, content knowledge outside of, well-covered events? Is it just you got too much to cover, too little time? Or is it that you got resources that focus on just a few iconic figures or events? Or perhaps are you dealing with something that, is not one of the options? Whew, got a lot of responses. All right. I got too much to cover, too little time. Let's see. Whew, I got a lot of people. All right. I got not enough time, a lot of C's, a lot of D's. All right. So definitely the scope of sequence seems to be an issue. I am seeing quite a few B's about limited content knowledge. All right. Just time, just resources. Okay, definitely focusing on iconic figures, and that's it. And thank you, Kristen. Kristen says all the above. All right, I love it. Okay, thank you. All right, well, with that in mind, let's kind of take a closer look at how else we can broaden the story of Brown versus Board of Ed and the road to school integration. Okay, all right, so I wanted to begin by first acknowledging where most of our curricula starts when discussing the civil rights movement. We all know that for most of us, we all are covering Plessy versus Ferguson, right? But and that's great. But the problem is that many curricula around the country, they introduce it as the first documented case of segregation in the country, and that's just not true. And a lot of textbooks that are out there actually center it or frame it like that. They also contextualize Plessy versus Ferguson as the singular event that gives birth to segregated schools in the South. It's almost like, okay, because Plessy versus Ferguson happened, then this allowed an explosion of segregated schools, and that's what you begin to see, and that's only when it starts, right? Next slide. And that's just not true. A lot of us are familiar with the fact that after the American Revolutionary War, a lot of northern states begin to enact gradual emancipation. Most Black people and many whites actually believed in the North that providing education was a part of gradual emancipation. For those of you who'd like to know more information, we had the African Free School movement, which definitely was associated with the assistance of white philanthropists. You had the New York Manumission Society. They built African free schools for education for people that were becoming free from gradual emancipation. Famous people that you probably taught about, Prince Hall in Massachusetts. He petitioned the Massachusetts legislature in 1787 for education for Black children because he argued, he's like, hey, Black people in Massachusetts, we're paying taxes too, so our schools deserve a school. Our students deserve a school, excuse me. The only problem is that by doing that, what we also begin to see is this is when we begin to see this emergence of separate schools for Blacks and for whites. So it's not with Plessy, we begin to see it a lot earlier. Next slide. So that helps to explain why in many areas you have segregated schools, like the one that Susan Clark was supposed to attend. Now, we actually have a resource available on PBS LearningMedia that tells more about Susan and Alexander's story if you'd like to use it in your classroom. And the cool thing about our resource is that it's actually accompanied by teaching tips. The media footage that we're giving you is usually no longer than maybe up to 5 or 6 minutes, just that nice sweet spot that our students need. And we make sure that we give you quality questions on all levels of Bloom's taxonomy and Marzano's questions that students can answer before they watch the movie, during they watch the clip, and then after they're watching the video. And we also provide you with discussion questions. Next slide. In addition to that, many of our resources are accompanied by independent student activities. So this goes along with the story of Alexander and Susan Clark. In this activity, we actually provide you with an essential question. Why was Clark versus Board of Directors such a strong precedent case for desegregation of public schools in the US? And then we provide students with an actual primary source from the case, right? And we also help with a graphic organizer that helps students to read, break down that difficult, sometimes legal text, help them to analyze it in a graphic organizer that meets the needs of students of varying reading levels. You can print these out and you can also modify it to meet more so the needs of your students. Next slide. Now, of course, that little activity that I did with y'all in the beginning, that's something that you could do with your students to actually get them hooked and to want to know more. Because I'm sure if you're teaching high school or middle school, there's a strong possibility that some of your students might have already heard of Brown versus Board. But if we do go back to the Can You Guess My Court Case activity, I wanted to point out that all of the distractors that I gave you, they were actual names of PBS learning resources describing other school integration cases that preceded Brown. So all of the distractors were actual cases that dealt with school integration, and they all came before Brown. For example, you had the 1885 Joseph and Mary Tate case, and that involved Chinese immigrants who sought to enroll their daughter, Mamie, in San Francisco Spring Valley primary schools, which was all white. The principal at the time, Ginny Hurley, refused Mamie's admission due to her Chinese American ancestry. And the California Supreme Court sided with the Tates, ruling that Mamie was entitled to the same educational rights as other children in the state. But they also ruled it was not illegal to have segregated schools. So while this case didn't achieve a fully integrated school system, it was a significant step and fighting racial discrimination, and it established the right of all students to access public education. Then another answer choice I gave you in our opening activity was Mendez versus Westminster. And this actually involves Sylvia Mendez of the Mendez family, along with 4 other Mexican-American families who successfully challenged segregation of Mexican-American students in California's public schools in 1946. In this case, the federal court actually ruled that the segregation of Mexican-American students was in fact unconstitutional, and it violated the 14th Amendment. But check this out. Thurgood Marshall, who many of us teach when we're teaching Brown versus Board of Ed, was actually involved in representing the plaintiffs in this case as well. Like this was almost kind of like the prequel to Brown versus Board. And this landmark decision paved the way for the Brown case, which declared segregation unconstitutional nationwide. Now, why am I going over this? I'm going over this because when you're thinking about teaching the civil rights movement, there are so many benefits in discussing these cases before Brown, because in many ways it could help our immigrant students or our non-Black students that are actually in our class better understand that, hey, Jim Crow was a system that impacted many students of color, not just Black students in this country. And by doing that, it might even help to encourage more interest in it. And it will encourage an even deeper appreciation of the efforts of the people who fought to dismantle it. Much more inclusive and larger story. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, I'm going to pause by saying, I know I'm giving you a lot of examples of resources that are out there. You are going to get a nice little sheet that's going to be emailed to you tomorrow. That's going to have hyperlinks to all the resources that you're going to hear, not only from me, but my colleagues as well, in addition to sources that we didn't have an opportunity to integrate into our webinar, but are available to you for free, by the way, with all the ready-made resources that I'm talking about. So don't feel pressured to write everything down. It will be coming to you tomorrow as long as we have your email on file. All right, I love it. I'm glad I make people happy. All right, so I wanted to continue talking. Another resources that I personally use in my classroom is The Long Road to Brown. And this provides additional context and history prior to Brown, such as the contributions of NAACP lawyer Charles Houston, who actually filmed the conditions of Black schools in South Carolina. And this actual resources has the image, the footage that he was able to get. So it lets our students see real time the conditions of their schools. It shows wooden schoolhouses with only 1 or 2 teachers who were paid far less than white teachers. You'll even see a school that has heating stoves, and that's what they use to keep them warm. And then a lot of times it smoked the children out of the building. This resources I really like using in particular because it really helps students better see just how real the disparity was. It's one thing to say that one school had more resources than another, but it's another to actually see it. A little bit more information about him, if you'd like. Houston was centered as the helm of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and it's him that helped the NAACP actually chart a step-by-step legal strategy to end segregated schools in the U.S. In this resource, you'll also learn about NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall. So once again, bringing in these familiar stories, but adding in some people they don't know. And an AME pastor and school teacher, Reverend Joseph Delane, along with 20 other African-American parents who filed suit against the county school board. This lawsuit is known as Briggs versus Elliott. And this was the first to challenge the constitutionality of public school segregation. And a week later, after this trial in South Carolina, where it takes place, lawyers left this and set off to Topeka, Kansas. So once again, these cases, they're important because it helps our students know that Brown versus Board was not a one and done case. It wasn't like, oh, we went to court with one case, we won, and now segregation is over. No, this is something that took years, all right, to actually to help challenge and dismantle. It also shows our students, right, that they can't always expect whatever civic issue they choose to champion or address to be a simple, quick win either. Next slide. Now, many of the cases that I've discussed so far can also be found in another great resource that I use personally in my class, and it's an interactive timeline. So we're actually going to go live to the site. There we are. Now, with this interactive timeline, if you take a look, it's got a timeline that integrates the stories of many of these cases that I talked about and many of the cases that I have not talked about that are on the road to helping us with Brown versus Board. See, once again, you got Mendez versus Westminster. It's got Brown versus Board there. It's got Ruby Bridges. And it also has the Little Rock Nine. And the cool thing about this timeline is that students are able to manipulate it, but the descriptions are succinct. So it's not too much trouble reading, but they're definitely detailed. And we have a variety of images, text, maps, and actual video like you see. We also, along with this, we're not just leaving you out there just with a timeline, but we created a independent student activity to guide students as they go through each of these court cases. And what these graphic organizers do that we've created was it helps our students to make sure that they're focused, make sure that they're accountable, and make sure they're actually understanding these cases that precede Brown versus Board of Education. And not only that, after Brown versus Board of Education as well, because the fight continues even after that. Next slide. So, it's also really important for our students to understand that the fight for school integration after Brown versus Board of Ed was not confined to the Deep South, right? So I would like to do one other activity with you, if I may. I want to draw your attention to the images on the screen. Now, each image depicts a situation that arose when a specific school system was in the process of being integrated. Can you use the images to guess where and around circle when you think these images were taking place? I'll give you a minute to go ahead and throw it in the chat. So let's take a look at these images. Using your detective skills, all right? This is the school system that was being integrated. This is after Brown. Where do you think it is? All right, so I got Boston, 1970, a lot of Boston. All right, Massachusetts in the house. We all saying it's the 70s. All right. Okay, everybody saying Boston, Boston, Boston. All right, 1970s. All right, some people say it could be Jersey, honestly. Yeah, it really could be, right? California's in the house. All right, okay, I got California, Boston, I got Jersey, I got Yonkers, 80s, Alabama. All right. Okay, great. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to watch a brief clip from one of our resources to verify which of your answers are correct.
Most of the teachers and administrators, they tried to keep us away from the windows because of what was going on outside.
At least twice, stones and bottles began to fly, and the police charged, led by policemen on horseback. The police charges cleared the way for the buses to pick up the black students at the end of the day.
It's clear whites who do not want blacks in their schools are acting in just the same way as violent whites in the South.
I'm not uncomplicit in this. If you saw it on the television, I was there. There was a sense that we were going to lose our community. I had no interest in throwing bricks or a rock, and most people didn't. We weren't raised that way, but it happened. People throwing bricks and rocks.
I was 8 years old, but I needed to feel or pretend that I was part of this thing. Throwing a rock was part of being of the mob, of the us.
When we got to the staging area, waiting for the buses to come back, we saw that the buses had broken windows. It was painful because the kids were coming out crying. Some parents showed up. Some of the kids didn't have their parents to support them.
When I reported to Kevin White on opening day that no black child had been killed, we thought that was a victory. It was the saddest day in Boston's history. But if a black child had been killed, there would have been a civil war.
Now, as you can see, these images actually took place in Boston, Massachusetts. So many of y'all were right on the money. Good for you. Segregation and violence surrounding school integration is not something that usually comes to mind, though, when our students think about Boston. They're thinking about the Boston Tea Party. They're thinking about the American Revolution. And it's important for them to understand that this fight for integration, it carries on after Brown well into the 70s. And not only that, this fight was national. So students can participate in the same activity that I did with you, but instead view the images online and write down their photo observations in this activity that we created. We asked them to tell us what they see for each image, what they think, what they wonder, and then we asked them to predict, where do you think this is taking place? They then watch the same clip that you watched. They list 3 facts they learned from Boston busing. This is the name of the resource. But more importantly, what I like about it is that they reflect on why they guessed the way they did prior to watching the film and why it's so important to learn about the fight for integration that also took place in the North. So I'm now going to turn it over to Lindsay, who's going to tell you about some more resources.
Thank you so much, Alicia. First, I just want to also say that I'm thrilled to be with all of you this afternoon or evening, and in part because I get to talk to you about one of the 20th century topics that has fascinated me the most, the diverse and unlikely participants of individuals, groups, and different grassroots organizations that built the civil rights movement. I personally, and I'm sure some of you also learned it this way as well, I learned a very top-down approach to the civil rights movement. Typically, the narrative went that there were 2 leaders. You had Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. You probably got a brief mention of the little old lady who was too tired one day, meaning Rosa Parks. You might have talked about the Montgomery bus boycotts, and then all of a sudden, seemingly one day, there was the passage of the Civil Rights Voting Act 10 years later in 1965. Some of you had mentioned earlier that there tends to be a lot of focus on just a few singular individuals when we talk about the civil rights movement, and it's often hard to get beyond that. But I do want to start by emphasizing the importance of building that foundational knowledge with your students as a way to help them expand their scope and sequence on the civil rights movement. And I think ultimately it will give them a richer and multifaceted way to examine civil rights. So tonight, as I guide you through some ways to deepen and expand your students' understanding of that diverse participation, I want you to consider 4 questions. The first question, how do we define the mass movement for civil rights in the United States? The second question, what and who gets included and what and who are left out? The third question, how can the past inform our present? And then the fourth question, how does the desire to define social movements within a particular construct shape our historical narrative? Put another way, why do certain narratives stay embedded in our historical knowledge? So for example, Rosa Parks remains a little old lady who refused to give up her seat because her feet were tired after a long day of work. One reason we teach history is to build on the knowledge that students already have. And when it comes to the civil rights movement, there are often names and faces and events that students recognize. So again, that's where I want to put in a quick plug here for connecting their existing knowledge and getting them to think a little bit deeper. We know that students learn best when new information builds on what they already know. So this is why I recommend using some of the resources that you see on the slide below. And don't worry, as Alicia mentioned, you're going to get links to all these resources later. But tonight I want to focus on one key figure, Rosa Parks. So the video you see here on your left, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, does a great job of showing how her activism began long before she refused to give up her seat. Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired seamstress who happened to make a stand that day. She had been involved in civil rights work for years. She was an organizer in her community, a member of the NAACP, and someone who actively protested injustice. It was through her job as a seamstress that she met Virginia Foster Durr, a white woman from Montgomery who had been involved in the New Deal. The two women became friends, and through their friendship, Durr arranged a scholarship for Parks to attend the August 1955 desegregation workshop at the Highlander Folk School, which was an interracial training center for labor and civil rights activists in Appalachian, Tennessee. Septima Clark, a South Carolinian activist and educator, led the two-week workshop and mentored Parks in that time. So Highlander Folk School was a really important place where thousands of Southern Blacks really worked to ingrain voting rights and stronger literacy within this experience. And so then Rosa Parks came back to Montgomery and she was so ready to work reform. And it was 4 months later that she refused to give up her seat. Now, with the context of this short video, it's just 6 minutes long, students are going to have a better understanding of not only why Parks was arrested, but also the broader response that followed and the context of why she took the action that she did. Within the video, they're going to learn about the creation of the Montgomery Improvement Association. They're going to learn about the vital leadership roles that were played by local churches and local leaders and how the community came together to really support the boycott, again, giving kind of the standard narrative that a lot of us know. And then students are going to be able to connect this story to their knowledge of Brown versus the Board of Education, as Alicia brought up earlier. And then they're going to start to see more legal and constitutional links. So the Montgomery bus boycott ultimately reaches the Supreme Court, where the justices extended the logic of the Brown decision to public transportation, ruling that separate seating on buses was unconstitutional because it was inherently unequal. Another powerful way to engage your students in thinking more broadly about the civil rights movement is to highlight some of the unlikely allies who supported the cause. In this case, people like President Harry Truman. Truman grew up in Independence, Missouri, a town that still celebrated its Confederate heritage. His grandparents on both sides were slave owners and Confederate loyalists. His mother once called John Wilkes Booth an American hero. And yet, in 1946, President Truman invited NAACP President Walter Light, along with a group of religious and labor leaders, to meet with him in the Oval Office. One of those leaders was A. Philip Randolph. We got a lot of questions about him in our pre-survey. So while he's not mentioned in the video, I did want to mention that this evening, that A. Philip Randolph worked really well alongside Walter White in this moment. So during that meeting, White urged Truman to support federal anti-lynching legislation. But it wasn't until White shared the story of Isaac Woodard, a returning Black World War II veteran who was brutally beaten and permanently blinded by a bus driver simply for asking to stop and use the restroom on his way home from fighting overseas. Truman was really moved to act. As a veteran himself, this story deeply struck a chord. Not long after, Truman became the first sitting president to publicly address the NAACP with Walter White by his side, and standing before the Lincoln Memorial, Truman declared, "There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry or religion or race or color. We cannot any longer await the growth of a will of action in the slowest state or the most backward community. Our national government must show the way." Following that speech is when Truman issued 2 landmark executive orders, one desegregating the federal workforce and the other desegregating the United States Armed Forces. Now, it's important that I'm clear. I want to be clear on this, that Truman still expressed racist views that were deeply problematic, but in his mind, there was no contradiction between those personal biases and what he believed were the government's legal and moral responsibilities to its citizens. He also knew that these actions could cost him politically. In fact, O'Friend warned him that he might lose his re-election bid for president, but Truman responded, "If I lose the election over this issue, it will have been for a good cause." The videos and resources connect to the story are incredibly rich. They include original footage, narration, and excerpts of Truman's speeches, offering students a clear framework for understanding the moral and political stakes of the early civil rights advocacy. Now that we've laid the groundwork here, we can start to begin to broaden our students' understanding of the deep coalitions that powered the civil rights movement. But in order to do so, it's worth asking, and Alicia mentioned this earlier, does the story have to start in 1954? Or can we expand our timeline to include earlier figures and efforts that laid the foundation for what came earlier, or what came later, rather? I think Alicia made a really compelling case for how we can broaden our understanding of civil rights, especially from a Supreme Court legislative battle. But I also wanted to put some people to consider. Maybe we could bring Ida B. Wells into this conversation. As a journalist, an anti-lynching crusader, and one of the founding members of the NAACP. Can't we recognize her as an early and essential leader? Can we connect her anti-lynching efforts to the work that comes later with, for example, Walter White? Or let's go ourselves and broaden ourselves deeply within the context of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Can we take Fannie Lou Hamer? By listening to her own words, her descriptions of growing up in deep poverty, the relentless barriers that Black Mississippians faced when trying to vote, we can help students make powerful connections to themes of justice and human rights. Her leadership in founding the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and challenging the official delegation at the 1964 Democratic National Convention is a vital chapter in this history. And finally, we can invite students to see themselves as active participants in civic life. Can they be change makers? By exploring the full scope of the Freedom Summer. So from the volunteers who registered voters to those who worked in freedom schools, these stories show that the civil rights movement was built by people of all ages, backgrounds, and experiences through a long arc of history. And so by expanding the time frame and starting to introduce some of these lesser known stories and voices, and I see that chat is so active with some other examples, and I love that, and I hope that you can take these other individuals from each other and look to incorporate them in your own classroom. We can really help students see that the civil rights movement is not a single moment in time, but a sustained collaborative effort that continues to resonate today. Now, I want to start looking and thinking about entertainers, another kind of unlikely ally, but important one in the work of civil rights. So Dick Gregory, who you see on the left, was a groundbreaking actor, comedian, and writer who rose to national fame in the 1960s. But unlike many entertainers of his era, he didn't shy away from politics. In fact, he really leaned into it, poking fun at bigotry and racism in the United States. He became a staple in comedy clubs, appeared on television, and released comedy record albums. Gregory used his celebrity status to bring attention to civil rights issues, particularly in the Deep South. One striking example comes from Mississippi in 1963. At this time, efforts were underway to register Black voters across the state. In response, state officials retaliated by cutting off food assistance and other aid to poor rural areas, punishing communities that were already struggling. It was especially a brutal move during the harsh winter. When Gregory learned what was happening, he didn't speak out, he took action. He personally financed and chartered a plane and sent 14,000 pounds of food to Greenwood, Mississippi. This act of direct aid drew national media attention and helped spotlight the brutal conditions many Black Americans were facing in the South, not just from discriminatory laws, but from calculated economic retaliation. It also enabled the Greenwood community to explicitly see the connection between their political participation in trying to push for their voting rights to actually getting food on the table. Gregory's work is a great way to talk about how celebrity can influence what is happening and how they can draw attention to injustices. So perhaps after showing his video to your students, maybe you can have them consider ways that we might see modern entertainers or artists or public figures starting to speak out and mobilizing their resources around injustice or humanitarian crises or voting rights. So what parallels do your students see? We also got another question asking, is there any way to incorporate music into this topic? So I thought I would give a great example of that we have in the collection. It really ties together music, the Cold War, international relations, and the human condition. So I'm going to set the scene. It's the end of 1956. Trumpeter and vocalist, the great Louis Armstrong, was rumored to be America's next cultural ambassador traveling to the Soviet Union for a truly groundbreaking tour. For those of you who don't know, the jazz ambassadors were a group of renowned American jazz musicians selected by the U.S. State Department to tour the world in the 1950s and 1960s. These tours really aimed to counter negative Soviet propaganda about the U.S. and promote American culture, including jazz, abroad. These jazz ambassadors, including Armstrong, toured throughout places like Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Central and Southern Asia, and Africa as part of cultural diplomacy. So for this evening, I want to show a quick excerpt from one of our videos that talks about Louis Armstrong's experience in the Gold Coast. And then we're going to do a brief exercise.
When we got off the plane, they had a little tune, all for you, Louis, la la la. And trumpets, 9 trumpets playing so beautiful. So I pulled mine out and played with them.
Thank you, folks. We'd like to lay this next one on the Prime Minister, Black and Blue.
That film footage of Armstrong in the Gold Coast, which is about to become modern Ghana, with Kwame Nkrumah crying, hearing a song that is iconic. It's iconic because it is about the internal pain, the interiority of racism. What does it feel like? What does it feel like to want to be other than yourself?
I'm white inside. That don't help my case. But I can't hide what is in my face. But by those I would it end. Ain't got a friend. My only sin is in my skin. Where did I turn to be so black and blue?
It's a song that speaks to not just the Black American condition, but the condition of all who have experienced some form of structural racism.
Just so you know, the rest of the video discusses how the unfolding school desegregation crisis in Little Rock really caused Armstrong to question his role as being a prospective ambassador for travel to the Soviet Union. And he openly speaks out against President Eisenhower, Governor Favos, and then he withdraws from negotiations to visit the USSR. So very quickly, I'm just going to show you part of an exercise that you can give your students, and I'll give you a few minutes to consider it as well. So one of the discussion questions that the resource support materials ask students to consider is, according to the video, Armstrong's song Black and Blue is about the internal pain and interiority of racism. What evidence from the lyrics supports his claim? Why do you think Armstrong chose this to sing this song in the Gold Coast? The lyrics are there. I welcome you to put any thoughts in the chat. But again, I'm already seeing really great conversation that I think your students can kind of grapple with the differences between the way Black versus white entertainers are treated at the time. How I really like Dawn's comment in entertainment. There's a lot of primary sources on the outrage when white people began listening and enjoying and understanding the music from jazz to blues to hip hop and began questioning the status quo. So I just want to give you a minute to reflect and think. Consider how you might use that with your students in the classroom. And while I wish we had way more time to delve into this, I just want to think of how in 5 minutes your students had exposure to so many different topics. They're looking at how the Cold War shaped the civil rights movement. They're considering what international relations looked like in the 1950s. And then they're considering how music can speak to the human condition, including the Black experience, the battle over desegregation in the South, and the pain of racism. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sue.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Lindsay. It's always a pleasure to come after Alicia and Lindsay. Those are tough acts to follow. I'm going to be speaking to sort of the civil rights movement after 1965, after the Voting Rights Act, and been thinking about some ways to broaden the narrative so that students don't leave class thinking that the civil rights struggle ended with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. In other words, how can we teach students that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, important as they were, did not solve problems of inequality, justice, poverty, and more, and what issues remained, and how can some of our resources support your integrating some of them into your curriculum. And I do just want to emphasize these are supplemental resources, and I was seeing early on that everybody's pressed for time. I recall that when I was in the classroom as well. So, don't think that you should expect to integrate all of these things all at once, but adding them a little bit at a time, I think is a great way to approach it. So I'm sort of building on what both Alicia and Lindsay have done, which is to sort of broaden the chronology of the civil rights movement, to broaden the actors in the civil rights movement. And I want to take a look at what are some of these other issues that linger, begin well before the civil rights movement, through the civil rights movement, and then linger even after the civil rights movement. And somewhat ironically, voting rights is one of those issues. It's one that doesn't begin or end in 1965. And the history of voting rights timeline here, and I'll go into it in just a second, is a core or foundational resource that shows students that the struggle to expand voting rights to many different groups has been going on since our nation's founding. And if this is the only resource that you have time to use, your students would learn about both past and contemporary voting rights issues. And of course, the 1965 Voting Rights Act is included here as well. So here is the timeline. And again, students can move as they wish through it. It makes sense to go chronologically, I think, but they learn initially, of course, that states were given the right to control voting, that voting was restricted to white men of property, and that was roughly about 6% of the population at the time. But as they move through, they see different players, they see different pieces of legislation, they see different institutions who were involved in trying to expand suffrage to different groups. And so you can move through and you see all these different groups, and eventually we will make our way up to the Voting Rights Act, and here that is as well. But again, voting rights extends past the Voting Rights Act. So we cover the 26th Amendment, Richardson versus Ramirez, Shelby, and then issues today about photo ID laws, but also efforts to make access to voting even better. As with all of our interactive resources, we create these independent student activities. And again, I saw in some of the questions prior to the webinar that people were asking, like, how do you make sure students are sort of accountable for the material? This is one way that you could do that. And what we're asking students to look at here is what change occurred with each of these events in the timeline. Do they think that it expanded or suppressed voting rights? What were the groups that initiated that change? And then what was the effect? And it's not always this sort of linear improvement, right? There are steps forward and there are also steps back. And then this question gets into what are the trends that students see in voting rights over time? What institution has had the greatest impact on voting rights? Is it the presidency? Is it Congress? Is it the Supreme Court? And then also what citizen groups played the most critical role? Because again, We're teaching civics here as well. And so who are the different players? What are the different institutions involved in this effort to expand voting rights? Back to this slide. These two resources on the right highlight, oh, excuse me, hold on, let me just go back. Highlight contemporary voting rights issues. So Shelby County v. Holder is a significant 2013 Supreme Court case that in many people's eyes gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It removes the pre-clearance requirement, and this was what required states and localities with a history of discriminatory voting practices to obtain federal approval before implementing any changes to election laws or practices. This court case did away with that pre-clearance requirement. And the ongoing fight is a wonderful video that focuses on contemporary obstacles to voting and also features the important roles that Black women have played and continue to play in the fight for suffrage 100 and more years after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Another issue or a different issue that you may wish to explore past 1965 is economic opportunity. And this video resource on the left is a great one. Students may be familiar with Dr. King's role in fighting for equal political rights, but fewer may know of his work to address economic inequality, poverty, and opportunity. In 1967, King launched his Poor People's Campaign, and that culminated with a march on Washington, D.C. in 1968. And in the second video, you can see this is a media gallery, so there's two video clips here. And in the second video, this provides students with a solid understanding of the movement and focuses in on the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, which took place from February to April 1968. And as you probably know, this is why King was in Memphis when he was assassinated. Going back in time a little bit, on the right-hand side is an interactive lesson called the New Deal and Residential Segregation. And this certainly gets at the links between residential segregation and poverty. And I want to go into this interactive lesson. Many of you probably are familiar with these. But if you are not, here we go. If you are not, this is a student-facing sort of self-paced lesson. Students can actually do their work directly in the lesson itself, and every interactive lesson is organized around an essential question. And this is the essential question here. How have government policies and practices contributed to what we call residential segregation? And this is, to me, a really fascinating history, because here you're taking the Great Depression and the New Deal and federal programs that were designed to be helpful to American citizens, and they end up causing actually quite a bit of damage. So the first New Deal agency is the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They're the ones who sort of had these residential security maps created to document sort of safe and desirable areas for mortgage investment. And this is where the term redlining actually comes from. Redline neighborhoods, which you can see here in the map. These tended to be mostly Black neighborhoods or immigrant communities that were considered high investment risks. And so it was very difficult actually to get funding, bank funding, mortgage investment to improve these communities. Then this resource talks about the Federal Housing Administration, another New Deal agency. And the FHA had money to give to investors, housing developers and builders of subdivisions. But to qualify for FHA financing, they often had to promise that they would build a physical structure, such as these 6 to 8 foot concrete barriers to separate the new whites-only developments that they were creating from their surrounding non-white communities. And these barriers become known as segregation walls or race walls. And many actually are around today. I think people have perhaps forgotten the origins of them, but the remnants of these walls in many communities exist today. And then the third part of the New Deal, this was actually came in the second New Deal, the Housing Act of 1937. This was an agency that actually created public housing. And this video is in this interactive lesson really explains how public housing went from, it was anticipated just to be a short sort of waylay on the way to home ownership. And instead, it becomes what we now know, or what we call today, as housing projects, and generally for minority residents. And this video talks about how did that happen. And then finally, we talk about a federal highway system. This is not a New Deal program, but it definitely is related to the suburban growth that came out of many New Deal policies. And here again, great destruction to urban communities that were sort of torn apart by the building of the interstate highway system. And then finally, why does all of this matter? Well, this page gets at sort of the long-term impacts of all of these federal policies. And here you can see the impact in home ownership rates, and here you can see the impact in medium home equity rates. And so that's just something to talk to your students about. How do these things that happened decades ago still impact economic opportunity even today? All right. Now, I know somebody in the questions asked about the Kerner Commission, and wouldn't you know it, we have 3 resources that teach students about the Kerner Commission. Again, this is taking place after 1965, certainly has to do with economic opportunity. And the Kerner Commission, as you probably know, was established by LBJ after a whole series of urban riots, including the LA Watts riots. And Johnson in particular was so perplexed, he's like, why is this going on? I've passed the Civil Rights Act, I've passed the Voting Rights Act, why aren't people happy? And so he pulls together the Kerner Commission and he charges them to find out, to go investigate, find out what is the problem here, and then make a report and recommendations. And they found that the anger and discontent that was happening across the country resulted from discrimination in policing practices, in the justice system, in consumer credit practices, in inadequate housing and public assistance programs, high unemployment, and exclusion of communities of color from the democratic process. And you may know its most famous quote, "Our nation is moving toward 2 societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal." So I really encourage you to check out those resources. And then one final issue that you might want to look at, again, what's happening post-1965 in the movement, is this sort of evolution of strategies and tactics that's being used. And so students, I think, generally just grow up learning about King and his nonviolent strategies. But other groups use different strategies, and it was out of necessity and also a sort of a discontent with the lack of progress. So Black Natchez Residents Combat Jim Crow teaches students about the limitations of nonviolent resistance in Natchez, Mississippi, and the need for self-defense. This is such an interesting story because it's sort of, it's a transition story. They use a boycott, but they also arm themselves in self-defense against the local police force. And then Coalition Building for Civic Change is a great interactive resource that really features the Black Panther Party and its role in Chicago. This is another example of a different strategy and different tactics in the civil rights movement. And one of the elements sort of featured in this interactive is how the Black Panther Party worked so hard to create a coalition for change with the Young Lords, which was a Latino group, and the Young Patriots, which was a white sort of Appalachian group. And they built a coalition to fight for change in this in Chicago in the 1960s. Whew. All right, so I know that we have thrown a lot at you, and as we've now said a couple times, you will be getting all of this stuff tomorrow, and links to all of these resources and more, actually, that we couldn't even get to tonight. But before we go, we'd love to know your thoughts on just one of the following. If you could put your answers in the chat, that would be great. Maybe which topic are you excited to add to your civil rights movement unit? Which resource do you want to share with your students? Or is there a topic you've wanted to teach but felt you lacked the right resources until tonight. Hopefully, we have helped you with at least one of those. And while you're putting your answers in the chat, I do just want to say this is what you will get access to tomorrow. We've created sort of a roadmap to our civil rights resources, and we've identified sort of key topics. We've identified what we think of as core or sort of traditional resources that will help you teach that. And then what are some more like inclusive resources that would help you broaden the story, broaden the narrative that you are teaching to your students. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Denise.
All right, well, we're at the end of our time together. I'd like to thank you all. Most were able to stay with us, and we appreciate that. Um, all the wonderful things you saw tonight are available on PBS Learning Media. And you can see some other things here that you may recognize, including American Experience and Ken Burns and Frontline. And we really would encourage you to go explore the platform. You don't have to have an account. Everything is free. If you have an account, you get access to things like scheduling, assigning through Google Classroom. So it's worth kind of exploring that as well. And next slide. And finally, we really do listen to your feedback as you heard the presenters tonight address some of the questions that you put in your registrations. And we'd like to hear what you thought about tonight's webinar. We can also see all the wonderful comments in the chat. But go fill out the survey. And if you do, you'll be able to download a certificate of attendance that you can bring to your administration for credit according to their policies. So thank you again. We're going to leave things open for just another couple of minutes to grab people's comments and to give you all a chance to sort of process everything. And if you have any questions about this or anything else, you can always email us at education@wgbh.org.